So I just wanted to ask you, I guess, just to start off, which is, we're talking about your book, obviously, Climb Your Mountain, Everyday Lessons from an Extraordinary Life. So what inspired you to write this particular book, and what do you hope readers will gain from it?
I found that over the time of giving lectures, which is how I make my living at the moment, that is what you get the questions on these things is what you get the questions from the audience. It's obviously, there is an interest by people who go to the lectures. I mean, I had one in Edinburgh recently at 1,500 people, and they asked questions of the nature, which I covered in this book. Not all of them, but some of them.
Yeah, I'm like, it's fascinating. It's there were different areas covered which I thought were really sort of useful life lessons. So I'm like, I remember you mentioned in your book, I think it's like a quote, which is, "A thing is so difficult, it's not worth attempting it." So when do you think is the best time to take risks generally?
Well, if you've set out what you are aiming to do, in the case of our group, we've spent 60 years actually going for world physical and geographical records that have not yet been done by people. And unfortunately, the reason they haven't been done by people is because they can be quite dangerous unless you plan very carefully and look to see where the people in the past who've tried have come to grief.
Yeah, indeed. It's incredibly dangerous. Definitely, especially some of the challenges were just, it was really harrowing to read about. But what is like the first push to help you actually start something when you start on these kind of these plans and these voyages?
When you have the plan and you know which record you're going for, you start off by contacting a possible sponsor. We, as always in 60 years, gone with the motto, never pay anybody for anything at any time. You get into debt that way. Overall, we've raised, at the last count, £19.8 million for the charities chosen very often by a sponsor. And people like Paul Sykes from the Sheffield area, originally, he has paid, if we need to climb a mountain and we aren't very good at climbing, then we need instruction from a really good climber, and that person will be paid by Paul, who has been behind it and knows this is a good way of getting money from the general public for chosen charities like, well, I'll tell you one or two. It went back to the 1970s, and our patron of the expedition, Prince Charles, he basically said one day when we went to brief him on the next expedition that we wanted him to be patron of, and he wouldn't be patron of any of the expeditions over all these 40 years or so unless we explained exactly what we were doing. And on this occasion in the mid-70s, he said, "And who this time are we going to be raising money for? Which charity?" And I had to say, "Sir, we don't raise money for charities. That's not part of it. We do science, and we beat the Norwegians, hopefully, or our main rivals at the time. And yeah, but we've never raised money." He said, "Oh dear, well, I wouldn't have been your patron if I'd known that, and I'm afraid you're going to have to, because it's a good way of getting money for good causes." So I said, "Well, who for?" He said, "I'd let you know." And a couple of months later, he chose multiple sclerosis, and we got 4.2 million just from that one as a result. We're up to 19.8 million just because of his one suggestion or comment.
That is incredible. Wow. Wow. I had no idea. That is incredible. Well, yes, that's a charity very close to my heart as well. I have multiple sclerosis, so that is really amazing that you've managed to do that. So thank you so much.
No, not at all. It's thank him.
Yeah, well, I know. Again, I'm like, I will have to ask you. I'm like, did fear ever stand in your way of like undertaking anything? Because I know you talk about the vertigo. So like, how did you manage this?
Well, my late wife died after 38 years of marriage, but I'd known her since she was about 9. And she died, and for a year or so, I really did nothing. I just, sort of sorrowful to be doing anything at all. And I thought, I must snap out of this. And what better way of really concentrating on something like trying to beat a phobia? And I had 2 phobias. One was spiders. But when I joined the Arab army, the Arabs, who I was in command of for a couple of years, fighting in Dhofar, at that time, the spiders were wolf and camel spider, 11 inches across, hairy with big eyes. And I was forced to either fear loss of respect from the people I was in command of for that period, wonderful Arabs, and or to do what I always did, which is to show my fear and sort of smash at them, in fear. When I first got dropped by an aeroplane in the desert to meet the 30 guys that I would be with for 2 years, they had a big fire and goat's meat, and sitting around the fire, one of these camel spiders right across the top of my trousers. And I know that I would have screamed and smashed it. The fear of losing their respect was even greater. And anyway, after 2 years out there in the desert, the spiders, coming in and out of your sleeping bag, they don't bite you, called non-forced confrontation, which slowly you lose your fear. But with vertigo, years later, as I say, after Ginny had died, with that vertigo, you have to find someone who's prepared to take you on, a really good climber, and teach you how not to be frightened.
Wow. Honestly, I would have screamed as well. Oh my God, that is horrendous. And very brave, I have to say. My God. Yeah, and you mentioned your lovely, late wife, Ginny, and obviously I wanted to ask, like, what role do you think she had, like, to play in your your success, and how you supported each other throughout, like, your adventures?
When we got married, after I got back from Arabia from the army and left the British Army from which I'd been posted, the only thing, I hadn't got any A-levels or anything like that, but I had been in the Cold War in Germany at that time, in the 60s, in a tank regiment. And my dad had been killed in the Second World War in the same regiment when he was colonel, and he was killed 4 months before I was born. But Mum told me all about him, and I grew up wanting to be a colonel of that regiment, the Scots Greys. The trouble was that, not in his day, but in my day, to go to Sandhurst College, which is necessary if you're going to try and be a colonel in the British Army, you have to have A-levels, which I hadn't got. So I only could spend 8 years in the British Army. That was what happens if you go not through Sandhurst, but through a cadet college, Modens. When we got married, after leaving the army, I wasn't sort of making an income. Jenny had been with the Scottish National Trust as a mountain guide up there, and was also back down south, and we needed an income. And Ginny knew that when I was in Germany during the Cold War, I'd been in charge of what they called adventure training, which was to take the Scottish soldiers, 600 in a regiment, but not more than that, maybe 24 at a time, canoeing on the rivers in Germany, like the Rhone and the Rhine and the Loire in France and so on, in summertime, and teaching them basic hill walking and so on with the right kit. And in winter in Bavaria, I taught them Langlauf cross-country skiing as the adventure training officer of that regiment, to stop the soldiers getting so bored because the Soviet army never did attack, and they started beating each other up in the navy. So
oh gosh.
Training was important. So Ginny said, well, why don't we do that as man and wife? We start a business. In those days they were called unicorns. So we did, and our rule, which I told you, was never to pay anybody anything. Don't have a bank account. Everything must be sponsored. And she reckoned that if we went for geographical records, at that time when people could only watch 4 channels on TV, BBC 1 and 2 and ITV 1 and 2, and the very favourite series in those days was called The World About Us series, and it very often would send a team BBC film documentary team on an expedition to cover it on film, and that would get your sponsors happy. And that's what Jenny suggested we do: start with big expeditions, not start small and try and get big. And it worked. So on one expedition alone, we had 1,900 sponsors, including a 40-year-old ice-strengthened ship and a resupply plane. We didn't fly, but had to be resupplied from it. And that was Jenny's suggestion at the time when she said, 2 of the expeditions we've done, it's worked. BBC have made films. We've got sponsorship when we want it now. So what we've got to do is move on to the really difficult one. And she suggested that the only polar expedition, which our rivals, the Norwegians, hadn't already done, was to go around planet Earth vertically instead of the normal way, which is horizontally. So the first surface circumnavigation of the Earth is what she decided we ought to do next. After 7 years' work on foreign offices, on practicing Greenland, selecting 2 people for the team out of 180 volunteers, and that was her plan, to answer your question.
Oh my gosh, she had some foresight, didn't she? She was really smart to have even thought of doing the hardest thing first, and because obviously, exactly, it paved the way, to so to speak, isn't it, for all the other expeditions. And I wanted to ask, like, would you say your North Pole expedition was the biggest challenge you've had to face during like your mountaineering expeditions? Especially how did you overcome actually coming back and dealing with your horrific injuries?
Well, I only had one hand, the fingers, frostbitten in all the years of the expeditions, but when I'm choosing a team, I wouldn't take somebody who had frostbitten fingers or toes, because you become more susceptible to it. So it would be stupid to take someone who is liable. And they're a nuisance, and they've been a nuisance ever since. One of the occupational hazards of doing that sort of thing, particularly in the Arctic, where you're falling into cold water, not the Antarctic, where you're falling into dry crevasse holes. Well, crossing Antarctica, which is bigger than America, and had not been crossed when we did it, except by a 2-team, one starting from one side and meeting in the middle sort of thing. Nobody as a single team from one side to the other by any route had ever crossed Antarctica. Not Scott or Shackleton, not Amundsen or Nansen, who one reads about and I've written about, but we did manage it, but only just. And the person who was with me, Professor Michael Stroud, is Britain's expert on stress nutrition. And when Jenny asked him to join us, he basically was the director of the British Army Personnel Research Establishment. And his expertise was, well, it's actually starvation, but he called it stress nutrition, which sounds better. And to see how a person can be made to travel much further in a war situation or any situation with less weight of food. So on the one you're talking about, the Arctic crossing, which we knew would, because it hadn't been done by the Norwegians, we knew it would be difficult. And he changed our normal diet for the expedition to 69% fat for 120 days. And I have to say that at the end of that expedition, I had a massive heart attack and double bypass, which I blamed on Mike, but it didn't stop us doing other expeditions after that.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's so crazy. Which brings me to my final question, because exactly, how do you balance the risks associated with these kind of trips with the rewards of achieving your goals?
Well, my wife Louise and my daughter was 17, Elizabeth. When I got married to Louise and Jenny, when she was alive, they both knew that I did that for a living, to make a living. So, and also when I'd been brought up, I didn't have a father. I had a mother, and she was a lovely mum, and Louise is a lovely mum to our 17-year-old daughter. And so I don't feel guilty, which one might think that I do. And as Ginny once said, you don't have to go on a polar expedition to come to grief. Every morning you can get run over outside Tesco's.
Very true. And yeah, I guess so. In a way, the end goal is worth it, isn't it?
Well, if you succeed, it is. But we then find you if you don't succeed, even though you've done really hard, and 40% over 60 years have been failures. But we include as a failure when we've broken the existing world record, but not got to the final goal.
Really? Oh, gosh. I would consider that a great success.
You know, when you do succeed, you obviously make a lot of noise about it in the media, because that is towards the sponsors, which, you know, we are very thankful to them. So we do what we promise, give them lots of photographs of their equipment being used in very cold or very, very hot if it's the Sahara. And then some of our expeditions, which you've been talking about, cold expeditions, you try and try again, whether they're hot or cold. And we knew that we would find the long-lost city in Arabia, the incense city of the Queen of Sheba in South Arabia, in the Rub al-Khali, or empty quarter. And we didn't find it for 21 years, 8 expeditions. On Everest, I tried climbing up on the Tibetan side with my black friend, Subu Sisu, who was the first black man to climb Everest, to do it from the other side. Asked if I would go with him. And he did get to the top, but he got hyper stuff from the altitude above 29,000 feet. He got to the top and made it down with help from the Sherpas. But I, about 6 hours from the summit, got another angina attack, so I didn't carry on. And then that was in 2005, and then so I had to try again, which is what you're talking about. You know, what do? You try again, and the second time I tried from the other side of Everest. I tried from the easy side, the Nepal, not Tibet, and again I failed. And again, I came down. At the end of that one, my charity that I'd been with at that particular time was called Marie Curie Cancer Care. And they said, look, if you try a third time with just one Sherpa, and you do it, because you've failed twice, you're now 65, you're an old age pensioner. You've been the first OAP to get up to the top. Yeah. We will definitely make, you know, over £3 million. Not necessarily old age pensioners, but they might, you know, think of it as understandable. And then we've had breakthrough breast cancer one year, and that was sponsored by James Dyson, and he made a brand new type of Hoover. Oh, sorry, not Hoover, the old Hoovers, a brand new type of vacuum, and it had paintings of person in Arctic gear on one side, and if you bought one, you made a little bit of money towards breakthrough breast cancer for the Dysons. And also the heart people, British Heart Fund, the Bristol have got a new wing using our money in Cambridge for multiple sclerosis and research for heart stuff. So yeah, they really changed. And the last one was it was for people who are born blind, particularly children who are born with cataracts. The money went towards operations for them. It was one of the British banks that operates in Bangladesh. I went out with the two other trustees, people who had helped on it, which was Joanna Lumley and Anton Aring, and the three of us went out with the BBC crew to show what happens with these children. Many of them in Bangladesh. And in the hospitals, we were there on a day when 200 of the children had one of their 2 cataracts removed when they were 2 years old. And it was wonderful. So just being with a mother and her baby, 2 years old, who she'd never seen, open their eyes, and the baby's never seen their mother. You're standing when they take off the operation stuff from their first eye, and that moment of them actually seeing each other was even better than the fact when you train nurses for multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow. Would you say that was the most rewarding part of it then?
Well, in terms of charity work, yes. The scientific work that we do, we take, if we're going to Antarctica and the Arctic on the ship, for instance, or when we're doing something with testing for stress, nutrition, and starvation, and all that sort of stuff, we write scientific notes, not us, but the people we take with us. And for instance, on the 3-year round the world, the ship was in both Pacific and Antarctica and the Arctic as well, and so on. And 2 top oceanographers from a university in South Africa were on board for 3 years with trawling nets to work out how the the little tiny fish are affected by the climate change and so on. So when a Canadian magazine in the 90s said in an article that my expeditions had no scientific value, we produced a 600-page report of all the scientists of our expeditions with help of the British Antarctic Survey and the director of the Royal Geographical Society and Dr. Heap. And there was a jury in London for 3 days who decided on the basis of just that one scientific report that our expeditions are normally of scientific value.
That is amazing. I'm like, that is quite an achievement and quite a feat. So I can't thank you enough for speaking with me. Honestly, it's such a honor to be able to speak to you, and I really appreciate it. So thank you for sharing your experiences and your time with me.
No, not at all. I'm glad you like the book. Lottie, that's lovely speaking to you. Thank you very much indeed.